What if a storm wasn't sent to destroy, but to reveal? As thunder cracked above Blue Heron Lake, Daniel Brooks heard Max bark, not in fear, but warning. Inside, lightning revealed a boy trapped under fallen wood, and one man, one loyal dog, racing the storm for a single heartbeat of life. Before we start Journey, please take a few seconds to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? Chapter 1. The Boathouse at the End of the Wind. The late afternoon air over Blue Heron Lake was cool and thin, carrying the faint scent of pine resin and rain-soaked wood. The sun leaned low, fractured across the rippling water like broken glass. On the far end of the dock, a pickup truck coughed twice before going silent, and from its door stepped a man whose posture spoke more of exhaustion than age. Daniel Brooks was 49, but the years had settled unevenly on him. His frame was broad, his shoulders sloped from years bent over engines, and his hands bore the gray calluses of a man who had turned wrenches more often than doorknobs. His face, sun-chiseled and marked by faint creases around the eyes, carried a kind of quiet stubbornness, the look of someone who had long ago made peace with disappointment. A faint stubble shadowed his jaw, 2 days past needing a razor. Life had not gone easy on Daniel, and lately it seemed to have stopped pretending it would ever try. A single passenger leapt from the truck bed behind him, a large German shepherd named Max, 5 years old, with a coat the color of burnt gold and black smoke. His ears stood like antennae tuned to every sound, the slap of water against the dock, the distant call of a loon, the creak of the old boathouse swaying slightly with the current. Max trotted ahead, paws clicking on the planks, tail wagging in gentle, controlled arcs. "This is it, boy," Daniel muttered, looking toward the structure that waited at the end of the weathered pier. The boathouse leaned as if tired of standing. Boards faded to a dull gray, its roof patched with rusted tin sheets that caught the light like dull coins. A place forgotten, much like the man who now stood before it. 2 weeks earlier, Daniel had been let go from the auto shop. The new owner wanted younger energy, though what he really meant was cheaper hands. Daniel had left quietly, wiping the grease from his palms and shaking the young man's hand, pretending it didn't sting. He had spent the days since then in the small rented trailer at the edge of town, counting dwindling bills and wondering how long before the phone company noticed the missed payment. Then came the letter, the one that changed the rhythm of his days. His uncle Raymond had passed. The old man had lived alone for decades, estranged from most of the family, save for Daniel, who visited once every few years out of a mix of duty and pity. Raymond had been a hard man, silent but precise, a carpenter of few words and fewer friends. The funeral had been small, mostly neighbors and a few curious relatives. When the will was read, the others had leaned forward expecting something tangible, money, land, maybe one of the fishing cabins on the South Ridge, but Raymond left each of them nothing except a polite blessing. Only Daniel received something specific, the boathouse on Blue Heron Lake, with all that it contains. They had laughed, of course. His cousin Pete had whispered, "Congratulations, Danny. You just inherited a pile of wet wood." The laughter had followed him out of the room, thin and cruel. Now, standing here, Daniel couldn't help but agree. The place looked ready to sink at the next storm. Yet something in him refused to turn away. Maybe it was pride, or stubbornness, or simply the need to believe that not everything in his life would end as a disappointment. Max sniffed along the edge of the dock, nose pressed to the planks. A moment later, he let out a low whine and pawed at a patch of moss near the step. Daniel crouched beside him, brushing it aside to reveal a small brass key nailed into the wood beneath. The key was old, green with tarnish. He pocketed it, unsure why the discovery made his pulse quicken. Inside, the boathouse was dim, but not unfriendly. Dust motes drifted in the sunlight, pouring through a cracked window, and the air smelled of cedar, oil, and lake water. A single workbench stood by the wall, littered with fishing lures, yellowed papers, and a half-empty thermos that looked as though it had been waiting for a hand that never returned. Max's claws tapped softly as he explored the room, nose twitching, tail held high. Daniel ran his fingers over a carved beam above the doorframe, tracing initials long worn down. R.B. 1968, his uncle's mark. For a moment, something inside him softened. He remembered summers spent here as a boy, when Raymond still smiled sometimes, teaching him how to sand a plank, how to measure twice, how to listen for the lake's breathing. Those were the days before Raymond's wife died, before he turned silent and sharp-edged, a man carved hollow by grief. "Guess we got work to do," Daniel said aloud, the sound startling in the quiet. Max barked once, short and affirmative, as if in agreement. They spent the next hours opening windows, clearing cobwebs, and sweeping dust into piles that shimmered in the dying light. Each small improvement felt like reclaiming something, a piece of his uncle, or perhaps of himself. As twilight stretched across the lake, Daniel sat on the porch steps, a tin cup of coffee warming his palms. Max lay beside him, head on his paws, watching the water ripple. The world felt distant here, the chaos of unemployment and bills swallowed by the rhythm of the waves. A car door slammed somewhere up the road, followed by muffled voices. Daniel turned, half expecting his cousins to appear and mock him again. Instead, an elderly mail carrier trudged down the gravel path, her uniform crisp despite the humidity. "Mr. Brooks?" she called. "That's me." She handed him a large brown envelope. "Came through probate office. They said it was part of your inheritance. Must have been delayed." Daniel thanked her and waited until her footsteps faded before opening it. Inside was a single folded document, property record, Blue Heron Boathouse, and at the bottom, a note, written in Raymond's shaky handwriting. "The real key isn't for a door." He frowned, reading the words twice. What the hell was that supposed to mean? The next morning, Daniel drove into the small town of Mill Haven to sort through the legal mess. The library stood at the corner of Main and Willow, a brick building with tall windows and the kind of hushed reverence that made people whisper even when they were alone. Inside, he met Grace Whitman, the head librarian. She was 52, tall and willowy, her silver-streaked hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, sharp but kind. The lines on her face weren't the kind carved by worry, but by laughter that had simply learned to rest. She moved with a quiet confidence, the kind of woman who had faced storms and learned to dance in their rain. When Daniel explained his situation, Grace tilted her head with a smile that carried both amusement and curiosity. "A mysterious boathouse and a cryptic note? Sounds like something out of a dime store novel. Except there's no treasure, just rotten splinters." "Well," she said, turning to her computer, "I suppose we can start by finding out how old your splinters are." Her voice carried the faintest lilt, like she was teasing the air itself. As she typed, Max, who had followed Daniel inside despite the "No Pets Allowed" sign, settled at her feet, tail sweeping the floor in slow contentment. Grace glanced down and laughed. "And who's this handsome rule breaker?" "Max Hamnim," Daniel said. "He's better behaved than I am." "I can tell." She reached down to scratch behind Max's ear, and he leaned into her hand, melting instantly. "Well, Max," she murmured, "I think you might be my favorite library visitor this year." Daniel watched, something unexpected flickering behind his ribs, an unfamiliar lightness he hadn't felt in years. After a while, Grace printed a few documents and slid them across the desk. "Here's the official record. Your uncle's ownership traces back to the 1960s. There's a note about a pending easement. Looks like he fought to keep that property from being developed." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "He never mentioned that." Grace's eyes softened. "Maybe he didn't need to. Maybe he left you the story instead." Then, after a beat, she grinned. "And if you ever need a book called How to Fix a Boathouse for the Recently Unemployed, I'll write you one myself." Max barked, tail thumping like a drum roll. Daniel laughed despite himself. "I'll take the first copy." As he left the library, the late light turned the town's brick streets gold. For the first time in months, Daniel felt a thread of something that might have been hope. But when he returned to the boathouse that evening, the sun nearly gone, and the lake a mirror of steel, he noticed something that made his breath catch. The front door, he was sure he had locked it before leaving, was now standing wide open. Inside, the air moved faintly, as though someone had just stepped out. Max's fur bristled, and a low growl rippled from his chest. Daniel reached for the brass key in his pocket, suddenly cold against his skin. The real key isn't for a door. He looked at the dark interior, the shadows stretching long and deep, and wondered if he was already too late to understand what his uncle had meant. Chapter 2. The Creaking Floorboard and the Fallen Key. The night was restless. The lake breathed in long, uneven sighs, and the wind pressed its cold fingers through the cracks of the old boathouse. Daniel Brooks sat by the hearth he'd coaxed to life earlier, watching the flames bend in rhythm with the wind's moan. Max lay curled at his feet, his ears twitching with every distant groan of the wood. The door that had been left open earlier was now bolted shut, but Daniel still felt the uneasy pulse of being watched. He told himself it was the wind playing tricks, yet something about the air inside seemed heavier, as if the walls remembered more than they cared to share. He had spent the day trying to restore order to the small space, stacking the old fishing rods against the wall, sweeping layers of dust into corners. But as he sat there now, sipping tepid coffee, he couldn't ignore the faint creak that came from beneath his boots. Max's head lifted instantly. The dog's brown eyes gleamed in the firelight, alert but unafraid. Daniel tapped to the floor with his heel. Another creak answered, hollow this time, deeper than before. He frowned, set the mug aside, and crouched. The plank nearest the hearth bowed slightly when he pressed down. He fetched a screwdriver from his toolbox, pried at the edge, and felt the nail give with a reluctant sigh. As he lifted the board, the faint scent of dry cedar rose, and beneath it, hidden so neatly it might have gone unnoticed for another decade, was a small brass ring fixed into the next plank. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. Max edged closer, nose quivering. "You smell that too, boy?" The ring was dull but sturdy. When Daniel pulled, the plank lifted with surprising ease, revealing a narrow opening about 2 feet wide. A draft of cool air wafted up, carrying the faint scent of dust and iron. He reached for the flashlight, thumbed it on, and peered inside. Wooden steps descended into darkness. Max gave a low rumble in his throat, but didn't back away. Daniel hesitated for a long moment before muttering, "If I get stuck, you're in charge." Then, crouching low, he lowered himself into the narrow passage. The steps groaned softly under his weight, but held firm. At the bottom was a space small enough to touch both walls if he stretched his arms. The air was cool, still, and dry, odd for a place so close to the lake. Against one wall sat a weathered chest made of tin and wood. Cobwebs draped its corners like fine lace. When Daniel brushed them aside, the lid lifted easily, and inside he found a collection of carefully wrapped objects: a leather-bound notebook, a folded map, and a small envelope sealed with dark wax. He sat cross-legged on the packed earth, Max's head now poking through the opening above, ears flicking forward with interest. Daniel unfolded the map first. It was hand-drawn, faded but legible, a detailed sketch of Blue Heron Lake and its surrounding forest. Several areas were marked in pencil: North Ridge Quarry, Cedar Trail, and a small X near the inlet labeled, "When the storm comes, the path will show." He turned next to the notebook. The cover was cracked, its edges soft from handling. Inside, each page was written in his uncle's neat, slanted hand. But instead of personal musings, Daniel found lists, names, dates, and short notes like "loan for timber crew," "repaid in part," or "food supplies for Marsh family, winter flood year." Page after page chronicled quiet generosity. Raymond, the man everyone had called bitter and reclusive, had spent years quietly aiding the struggling workers of the lumber company and the fishing docks. Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling a tug in his chest. "You old fool," he whispered. "You helped everyone but never said a word." At the bottom of the chest lay a small brass key, heavier than it looked, its head engraved with the letters MBT Co. Millhaven Bank and Trust. Daniel turned it over in his hand, tracing the worn grooves. There was no note explaining what it unlocked, only that sealed envelope. The wax cracked under his thumb, and inside was a single sheet of paper bearing Raymond's spidery script. "Daniel, when the storm comes, you will see the road. Until then, keep faith." He read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it back into the envelope. A riddle, or perhaps a warning. Either way, it was something meant only for him. Back upstairs, the fire had burned low. Max circled twice before lying down again, though his gaze stayed fixed on the open hatch. Daniel closed it gently, resting the lifted plank back in place, and sat for a while longer, staring at the floor as if it might whisper more secrets. The next morning dawned pale and cool. The fog over the lake was thick, and sunlight broke through in soft ribbons. Daniel drove into town, the brass key tucked safely in his pocket, and headed once more for the library. The place smelled of coffee and paper, and Grace Whitman greeted him with her usual quiet smile. "Back already?" she teased, brushing a stray lock of silver hair behind her ear. "Either you finished rebuilding that boathouse overnight, or you found something worth reading about." Daniel smiled faintly, maybe a little of both. He laid the notebook and map on the counter, I think my uncle was up to something. I found this under the floor last night. Grace's eyes widened slightly as she adjusted her glasses and leaned closer. My, that handwriting's beautiful, old-fashioned, steady. Not many people write like this anymore. She flipped a few pages, her expression shifting from curiosity to awe. He kept records of charity work. This is practically a hidden history of our town. Looks that way. She glanced up, her blue eyes bright with excitement. Daniel, this could be important. Some of these names, look, the Marsh family, the Hensleys, they were all tied to the lumber union that disbanded in the 70s. Your uncle might have been their benefactor. Why keep it secret, though? Daniel asked, rubbing the back of his neck. Some people do good because they can't stand the noise of being thanked. She smiled softly, then pointed to the map. And this? When the storm comes, you will see the road. That's poetic. Or dangerous. They bent over the papers together, the soft rustle of pages mixing with the whisper of the ceiling fan. Max lay between them, occasionally pawing at Grace's skirt, demanding affection. She laughed, reaching down to scratch behind his ear. You, sir, she said to the dog, are the best emotional supervisor I've ever met. Yeah, Daniel chuckled. He doesn't like it when people argue. Keeps the peace better than most politicians. As they worked, a shadow fell briefly across the library's doorway. Daniel glanced up to see a man lingering outside, his face half obscured by the sun's glare. The figure moved on, but something about his posture, a slow, deliberate turn of the head, made Daniel uneasy. Grace noticed his distraction. Everything all right? Yeah, just thought I saw someone I knew. By late afternoon, Daniel drove back toward the lake, thoughts swirling. The map, the note, the key. It all hinted at something larger, but what? When he pulled into the gravel drive, his cousin's old green SUV was already parked near the dock. Peter Lang, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, leaned against the hood. His once handsome face had grown soft with indulgence, though the smile he offered was still sharp. Well, look who's moved in for good, he said. Thought I'd come by, see the famous inheritance. Didn't think you cared much for the place, Daniel replied evenly. Peter shrugged. Didn't. Till I heard some developers got his eye on this lakefront. Figured maybe we could talk about it. Daniel stiffened. We? Before Peter could answer, another vehicle pulled up, a sleek black truck that didn't belong to any local. The man who stepped out was tall, lean, dressed in an expensive field jacket. His hair was slicked back, and his jawline carried the kind of precision that came from both money and arrogance. This must be the nephew, he said, extending a gloved hand. Name's Dalton Reed. I'm with Harborfield Development Group. His voice was smooth, practiced. We're putting together plans for a lakeside resort. Your property happens to be the missing piece. Daniel didn't take the hand. Not interested? Dalton's smile tightened, the kind that never reached his eyes. Everything's for sale, Mr. Brooks, especially things that don't pay the bills. Some things aren't meant to be sold. Peter stepped between them, palms raised. Come on, Danny, don't get righteous. It's just business. You could make a clean break, walk away with real money for once. Daniel felt Max press against his leg, tense and silent. The wind picked up, tossing ripples across the lake, and for a moment, it seemed as if the water itself was listening. Get off my property, Daniel said quietly. Peter's smirk faltered. Dalton adjusted his gloves, studying Daniel like a puzzle piece refusing to fit. We'll talk again, he said finally, turning toward the truck. Storm's coming. Maybe you'll see reason when it does. As the vehicles disappeared up the road, Daniel stood by the dock, jaw clenched, the brass key in his pocket burning cold against his palm. The clouds above were already thickening, dark and heavy, the promise of rain carried on the wind. Max growled softly, eyes fixed on the distant road. Daniel looked toward the boathouse, where the faint sound of creaking wood echoed through the walls. When the storm comes, he muttered, maybe I will see the road. But for now, all he could see was the storm, and it was already on its way. Chapter 3. The storm in the bark that called a man. The storm came not with warning, but with conviction. By dusk, the wind had turned feral, shredding the calm surface of Blue Heron Lake into white-edged fury. Rain lashed the boathouse roof in relentless bursts, seeping through old seams and singing against the tin like 1,000 desperate fingers. Daniel Brooks stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the storm roll across the black horizon. The lightning came in sheets now, lighting up the lake for a wakching, a heartbeat each time. revealing a world half drowned, half alive. Max paced near the door, restless, tail stiff and ears pricked. Every gust made the wood groan underfoot, but Daniel could tell this was more than wind that stirred the dog. He turned down the lantern wick and crouched beside him, resting a hand on the shepherd's thick coat. Easy, boy. Just thunder. But Max's low growl said otherwise. The storm deepened. Branches clattered against the roof, and waves slammed into the dock, sending vibrations up through the floorboards. Daniel was reaching to bolt another window when a sharp metallic clang echoed outside, followed by a faint cry, high, thin, and unmistakably human. Max barked once, sharp as gunfire, then darted for the door. "Max, stay!" Daniel shouted, but the dog was already out into the storm, his dark coat swallowed by rain. Daniel grabbed his jacket and flashlight and plunged after him. The wind tore at his hood, and rain stung his face like needles. Through the blur, he saw Max's shape darting toward the old storage shed that sat half-collapsed near the waterline. The shed had once been Raymond's tool house, a narrow, timber-walled thing with a rusted tin roof and a warped door that refused to close. Now, under the assault of the storm, it looked ready to break apart entirely. As Daniel neared, Max barked again, a sound of urgency, not fear. He wrenched open the shed door, and the flashlight beam swung wildly through the dark, illuminating a scene of chaos. Shelves knocked in, roping and nails scattered across the floor. And under one of the fallen racks, half buried in debris, lay a boy. He couldn't have been older than 12. His face was pale beneath streaks of mud, his short blonde hair plastered to his forehead. He was conscious but struggling to breathe, his leg pinned beneath a heavy plank. "Help!" the boy gasped. "Please, can't move my leg." Daniel's heart jolted. He knew that face. Eddie Lang, Peter's son. The last time he had seen the kid was at the funeral, quiet, polite, clinging awkwardly to his father's sleeve. How the hell did you... Never mind. Daniel dropped to his knees, tested the weight of the plank. Too heavy to lift barehanded. "Max!" The shepherd was already circling, tail tucked, searching for a way in. "Find rope!" Daniel yelled, though he wasn't sure the dog would understand. But Max darted back into the rain, vanishing toward the dock. "Stay with me, kid," Daniel said, gripping Eddie's shoulder. "Can you feel your toes?" I think so." "Good. That means we've got time." Minutes passed in a blur of rain and thunder. Max returned, dragging a frayed coil of dock rope between his teeth. Daniel looped it around the plank, tied it off to a beam, and wedged a crowbar underneath. "When I say pull, you pull with everything you've got, boy." Max barked once, his eyes steady and bright. Daniel heaved on the crowbar. "Pull!" Max leaned back with all his strength, teeth clenched around the rope. The plank shifted, just enough for Daniel to drag Eddie free before the structure groaned ominously overhead. He grabbed the boy and stumbled out into the rain as the shed's roof caved in behind them with a thunderous crash. Outside, the storm swallowed everything, wind, breath, even thought. Daniel half-carried Eddie back toward the boathouse, Max circling anxiously at their side. Lightning carved the sky open as they reached shelter. Daniel set the boy by the hearth, quickly wrapping his leg in a torn towel. "You're all right now," he said, trying to steady his own shaking hands. Eddie's teeth chattered. "My dad, he said he was meeting someone, by the dock." Daniel froze. "Meeting who?" Before the boy could answer, Max lifted his head and growled, low, guttural. The dog stood, staring toward the door. A faint metallic clink echoed from outside. Daniel grabbed the flashlight again, motioning Max to stay close. The door creaked open under the wind's push, and Daniel stepped onto the porch. Through the rain, a shadow moved near the side of the boathouse, deliberate, crouched. The beam of light caught a man's face for an instant. Dalton Reed. He was drenched, his expensive coat plastered to his frame, his gloved hands busy unscrewing the latch to the storage hatch under the house. A small red gas can sat beside him. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Daniel's voice cut through the storm. Dalton straightened slowly, water dripping from his hair, his smile almost polite. "Just checking on my investment," he said. "You don't own this place." "Not yet." His eyes flicked toward the hatch. "But I thought maybe your uncle left something worth finding. You know how old men get. Sentimental, secretive." Daniel stepped closer, fists tight. "That's trespassing." Dalton's smile faded, replaced by something colder. "Everything has a price, Mr. Brooks. Even your righteousness." Before Daniel could respond, Max lunged forward with a snarl, teeth bared. The gas can tipped, spilling its sharp, acrid scent into the air. Dalton stumbled back, swearing, and Daniel seized the chance to grab the can, tossing it into the lake. "Get out," he growled. Dalton hesitated, then laughed softly. "You're a stubborn man, but storms pass. Deals remain." He turned, disappearing into the sheets of rain. Daniel watched until the darkness swallowed him, then looked down at Max. The dog's fur was bristled, his breathing fast but controlled. "Good boy," Daniel murmured. By dawn, the storm had exhausted itself, leaving the world gray and heavy with mist. The dock was half submerged, pieces of driftwood and leaves scattered across the shore. Eddie still slept near the fire, his bandaged leg propped on a cushion. Grace arrived soon after, her raincoat soaked, her hair tied back hastily. She had driven through the tail end of the storm after hearing about the commotion on the police scanner. "I swear, Daniel Brooks," she said breathlessly, "you attract trouble like a magnet." Daniel managed a tired smile. "Good morning to you, too." Her gaze softened when she saw Eddie. "Oh, poor child." She knelt beside him, checking his pulse with the gentle efficiency of someone who had raised children once and never quite forgotten how. "You saved him?" "Max found him," Daniel said. "I'd just followed orders." Max wagged his tail once, bashful under praise. Grace smiled. "Then we owe him a medal." Outside, the lake was strangely still. The waterline had dropped just enough to expose something near the northern edge of the dock, a faint outline of stones forming a narrow path that disappeared beneath the reeds. Daniel stared, heart hammering. "Grace," he said quietly, "come look at this." They stepped outside, Max leading the way. The path was real, glistening under the newborn sun. At its end stood an old boundary marker, half buried in silt, its engraving barely visible. "Property of the Hawthorne Trust, 1899. To be preserved for the public good." Daniel knelt, brushing mud away with trembling hands. This must be what he meant. "When the storm comes, you will see the road." Grace bent beside him, reading the words aloud. "Your uncle didn't just own this place, Daniel. He protected it." Further down, half hidden under stones, was a small metal box sealed in wax. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were papers, deeds, trust documents, signatures, proof that Raymond Brooks had established the lakefront as a community preserve, untouchable by private sale. Daniel looked out over the water, the morning light breaking in soft ripples across the lake. The air smelled of rain and pine, clean and sharp. He exhaled, the weight of years lifting from his shoulders. Guess the old man knew what he was doing after all. Grace smiled, her eyes reflecting the same glint as the water. "Seems he left you more than a house, Daniel. He left you a purpose." Behind them, Max barked once, sharp, joyous, as if to confirm it. But when Daniel turned back toward the boathouse, a movement caught his eye. Across the lake, near the tree line, a figure in a dark coat was watching them through the mist. Dalton Reed. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. Daniel's jaw tightened. "The storm may be over," he said softly, "but I don't think the fight is." Max's ears flicked forward, tail low, ready. The air felt charged again, quieter now, but no less dangerous. And far across the still lake, thunder grumbled one last time, as if to remind them, some storms never really end. Chapter 4. Sunlight on the old papers. Morning arrived timidly, as if afraid to disturb what the storm had left behind. Mist still hovered over Blue Heron Lake, its surface bruised silver under the waking sun. The boathouse creaked softly with the movement of water, every sound quieter now, as though the world had taken a breath after holding it too long. Daniel Brooks sat at the small wooden table by the window, the documents from the hidden box spread before him like pieces of a long-forgotten map. He had dried them carefully overnight, each sheet fragile as autumn leaves, and now the sunlight filtered through the lace of the curtains, revealing Raymond Brooks's familiar handwriting across the pages. The brass key, the one marked OPMBT, lay beside a cup of coffee gone cold. Daniel turned it between his fingers, watching the light flash off its worn grooves. "You really never stopped planning, did you, old man?" he murmured. Max, sprawled on the rug with his chin on his paws, gave a quiet grunt of agreement. His fur still smelled faintly of smoke and rain. When Grace Whitman arrived later that morning, she carried the brisk confidence of a woman who refused to be intimidated by official buildings or complicated paperwork. Her navy cardigan clung to her slim frame, her hair neatly pinned but never quite tamed, silver strands catching the light. "I've been thinking," she said as soon as she stepped through the door, "if your uncle went through the trouble of creating a trust, that key must open a safety deposit box, likely at Millhaven Bank and Trust." Daniel smiled wryly. "You'd make a fine detective." "Please," she said, setting down her leather satchel. "I prefer the term archivist of secrets." By mid-morning, they stood in the lobby of the old Millhaven Bank, a red brick building with marble floors polished so smooth it reflected their shoes. Behind the counter sat Mr. Harold Benton, the branch manager, a short, round man in his early 60s with a neatly trimmed gray mustache and the cautious smile of someone who had seen too many strange requests. His wire-framed glasses perched low on his nose as he peered at the documents Grace handed him. "Raymond Brooks, you say?" Benton adjusted his glasses and nodded slowly. "Name rings a bell. A quiet man, always paid in cash. Haven't heard that name in years." Daniel showed him the brass key. "We think it belongs to one of your safety boxes." Benton took the key, squinting at the faint engraving. "Box number 104A belonged to Mr. Brooks indeed. I'll need to verify your authorization, of course." Grace stepped forward smoothly, unfolding the notarized will. "You'll find his signature matches here," she said, her voice polite but firm. Benton read it carefully, then looked up, impressed. "You've done your homework, Ms. Whitman." "I work in a library," she said with a faint smile. "We don't open boxes, but we do know how to find what's inside them." 10 minutes later, Benton returned with a narrow metal box. "Do you dull with age?" "This is it," he said solemnly, setting it on the counter. Daniel hesitated before unlocking it, half expecting the contents to vanish like smoke. The key turned easily. Inside lay an assortment of objects wrapped in parchment, a few government bonds, several antique silver coins, and a sealed envelope marked "For Daniel Brooks" upon the storm's passing. His breath caught as he opened it. Inside was a typed document, yellowed but clear. The heading read, "Addendum to the Last Will and Testament of Raymond Brooks." Grace leaned closer as Daniel read aloud, his voice low but steady. "I, Raymond Brooks, appoint my nephew Daniel Brooks as trustee and caretaker of the Blue Heron Boathouse property, to be maintained for public use and the education of youth in skills of craft and watermanship. He shall ensure its purpose, to give honest work and steady hands a place to belong, is upheld beyond my years." When he finished, the room was quiet except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Grace's eyes glistened. "He trusted you with his legacy, Daniel. That's not just an inheritance, it's a calling." Daniel swallowed hard, tracing his uncle's signature. "All this time, I thought he just left me a pile of wood and memories. Turns out he left me a job to finish." On their way out, Benton stopped them at the door. "Mr. Brooks," he said kindly, "your uncle was one of the good ones. He'd come here every winter to renew a small savings bond for the lumber apprentices. Said it was for boys who needed a second chance. Looks like that torch is yours now." Outside, sunlight glinted off puddles still scattered along the street. Grace tucked her arm through Daniel's, a gesture so natural it surprised them both. "So, Mr. Trustee," she teased gently, "what's next?" He looked out toward the distant line of trees. "We rebuild, not for profit, but for purpose." Back at the lake, Peter Lang was waiting. He stood near the dock, his posture heavier than Daniel remembered. His clothes were wrinkled, eyes rimmed from sleeplessness. The storm had aged him overnight. "I heard about Eddie," Daniel said quietly. "How's he doing?" Peter nodded. "He'll be fine. Doctor says no fracture, just a bad bruise." He hesitated, then added, "He told me what you did, what you and that dog did." His gaze flicked toward Max, who stood alert by Daniel's side. "You saved my boy. I don't have words for that." Daniel studied him for a moment, the anger from past grudges fading like mist in the morning sun. "You don't owe me anything, Pete. Just take care of your son." Peter swallowed, his voice rough. "I was wrong about you, about the place, too. Guess I let the wrong people whisper in my ear." "Yeah," Daniel said softly, looking towards the tree line where Dalton had last been seen. "He's not done whispering yet." Peter shifted uncomfortably. "I told him to back off. I don't think he will. He's not the kind who lets go easy." "Then we'll be ready," Daniel said simply. He offered his hand, and after a long pause, Peter took it. The days that followed felt different, lighter. Daniel and Grace threw themselves into plans for what they began to call the Boathouse Club. She managed the paperwork, dealing with town permits and skeptical officials, while Daniel handled the repairs, sanding planks, reinforcing beams, and fixing leaks with the precision of a man who finally knew why his hands had learned patience. By the end of the week, the place began to transform. The air smelled of sawdust and lake breeze, and laughter echoed across the water again. Children from town came by, curious, offering to help. Grace brought cookies, Daniel had brought his gruff humor, and Max, now sporting a red bandana, became the self-appointed doorman. He would sit proudly at the entrance, tail thumping, allowing everyone in except those who failed to greet him properly. When one visiting councilman ignored him, Max gave a single disapproving bark, until the man sheepishly reached down to pat his head. The room erupted in laughter, tension gone in an instant. One afternoon, during a small fundraising meeting, Grace was mid-sentence about restoration costs when Max trotted over to Daniel's lunch bag, stole his sandwich, and pranced triumphantly across the room. Daniel gave chase, muttering curses that only made Grace laugh harder. The sight of the once brooding mechanic stumbling after a grinning dog filled the boathouse with warmth, deeper than sunlight. The donors laughed too, and by the end of the day, they had pledged enough funds to cover the first stage of repairs. That evening, as the last guests left and the lake shimmered under the dying light, Grace lingered by the door. Daniel leaned against the frame, his hands still dusted with sawdust. "You know," she said softly, "I haven't heard laughter like that here in years. It's like your uncle built this place to hold joy, and it was just waiting for someone to unlock it." Daniel smiled, tired but peaceful. Maybe that's what he meant by the real key. Grace's gaze met his, steady and kind. "You found it, Daniel. You just didn't know it yet." Max gave a low, contented woof, curling beside them. Outside, the water rippled gold beneath the sunset, and the boathouse, once broken and forgotten, stood proud again, alive with new beginnings. Chapter 5. The Festival on the Wooden Pier. The morning of the festival rose clear and golden, as though the lake itself had chosen to bless the day. Sunlight rippled over the surface of Blue Heron Lake, scattering across the freshly varnished hulls of the small boats tethered near the pier. The boathouse, once gray and weary, now stood proud in its rebirth. Roof shingles gleaming like new coins, windows trimmed with white paint, the air rich with the scent of pine tar and polished wood. Laughter drifted from the docks, mingling with the rhythm of hammering, tuning fiddles, and the occasional bark from Max, who had taken it upon himself to oversee the morning's setup with grave importance. Daniel Brooks stood near the entrance, hands in the pockets of his freshly laundered denim shirt, watching as townsfolk arrived one by one. He had trimmed his beard that morning, an act Grace had teasingly called a small miracle, and his dark hair, streaked with silver, gleamed in the sun. The months of labor had carved a leaner strength into his shoulders, and though his hands still bore the roughness of a mechanic, his expression carried an ease that had long eluded him. Grace Whitman moved among the crowd like sunlight itself, calm, warm, and unmistakably present. Her auburn silver hair caught the breeze as she greeted guests, her laugh lilting and bright. She wore a soft blue dress and a cream cardigan, practical but graceful. There was something luminous about her, not from youth, but from a life lived deeply and kindly. In her presence, Daniel often forgot the years he'd wasted in quiet bitterness. Children darted along the pier, clutching small paper boats painted in bright colors, while a trio of local musicians tuned their instruments near the steps. Among them was Evelyn Shore, a stout woman in her late 50s, with a shock of white hair tied in a bun, and fingers calloused from years of playing the fiddle at every town gathering. Beside her stood her husband, Tom Shore, tall and thin with a soft gray beard and a voice that could hush a storm. They had volunteered to provide music for free, because, as Evelyn put it, Raymond Brooks once lent Tom a hammer and never asked for it back. As Daniel looked around, he saw faces that once regarded him with polite suspicion, now filled with genuine warmth. Fishermen, carpenters, retired dockhands, and teenagers from the trade school he had helped sponsor. Each one had, in some small way, touched the project, sanding, painting, hauling timber, or simply showing up with coffee when the work stretched into the night. Near noon, Peter Lang arrived with his son Eddie. Peter looked changed, the kind of change that begins not in posture but in spirit. He wore simple clothes, his once oily hair now combed neatly, and the nervous arrogance that had clung to him seemed replaced by humility. Eddie limped slightly, but beamed as he carried a small, handmade plaque. When Daniel knelt to read it, he smiled. The boy had carved a heron rising from water, the wood polished smooth. "Made it myself," Eddie said proudly. "Dad says you taught me patience." Daniel chuckled. "You taught yourself that, kid. I just gave you a stubborn example." Peter extended his hand. "You gave me a second chance, Daniel. You could have turned me away after all that mess, but you didn't." Daniel shook his hand firmly. "We've all been lost before, Pete. The trick is learning when to stop wandering." Before either could say more, Grace called out from the porch. "Everyone, gather around!" Her voice carried clear over the chatter. She held a sheet of paper, the official proclamation from the county, and waited until the crowd stilled. "Today," she began, "we dedicate the Blue Heron Boathouse as a community heritage site, protected under local trust. This is not just a building, it's a promise to work with our hands, to teach with our hearts, and to remember those who built before us." Applause rippled through the crowd. Daniel caught sight of Mr. Harold Benton, the banker, clapping from the front row, his spectacles glinting. He had insisted on attending, though he had claimed to hate outdoor events. Grace continued, smiling. "And we have one more thing, a scholarship fund, created from the very bonds found in Raymond Brooks's deposit box. This fund will support young apprentices and retired workers who want to learn or teach woodworking, boat making, or simply how to believe in second chances." At that, Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. He looked toward the lake, whispering quietly, "You did it, old man. You really did." After the ribbon was cut, Max insistently tugging one end before it could fall, the celebration unfolded like a summer symphony. Evelyn's fiddle soared above the chatter. Kids raced paper boats across the shallows. The smell of grilled corn and apple pie filled the air. Max, wearing his bandana, patrolled with purpose, accepting pets like a celebrity and occasionally sneaking food from unwatched plates. At one point, Grace caught Daniel watching the crowd with quiet pride. "You look like a man who just finished a marathon," she said softly. "Feels like it," he replied. "Except this finish line actually means something," she smiled. "You've built more than a boathouse, Daniel. You've built a home for everyone who needed one." As afternoon turned to evening, the golden light stretched long across the dock, painting the wood in amber hues. A breeze carried laughter and fiddle notes across the lake, while lanterns were lit one by one along the railings. The inscription on the new sign glowed in the light, "For the working hands and the hearts lifted by the water." Later, after the guests had drifted away and the music had quieted, Daniel and Grace sat together on the pier. The water lapped softly beneath them. Max lay beside their legs, his breathing slow, content. Grace broke the silence first. "You ever think your uncle knew we'd end up like this?" Daniel chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "If he did, he was smarter than I gave him credit for. At my age, Grace, I've learned I don't need fireworks or miracles, just a warm stove and someone who understands me." She smiled gently, her eyes catching the reflection of lantern light. "Then I suppose we're both rich beyond measure." He turned to her, hesitating for a heartbeat before taking her hand. The air smelled of cedar and the last traces of rain. "Guess Max approves," he said when the dog shifted, resting his head on their joined hands with a soft huff. Grace laughed quietly. He's always had good judgment. The world around them seemed still, the kind of stillness that only comes after storms, when the air holds both memory and promise. Daniel looked out across the lake one last time. "You know," he said, reaching for the small leather-bound journal Raymond had left, "there's something I need to finish." He opened to the last page and wrote carefully, the ink catching the lantern's glow. "If the lake has a secret, it's this. Those who learn to give will always be repaid, sometimes with a boathouse, sometimes with a heart, and sometimes with a dog who knows the way home." He set the pen down, watching the ink dry. Grace leaned her head gently on his shoulder, and Max shifted closer, pressing his warm weight against them. The water sighed beneath the dock, the stars began to bloom across the sky, and the boathouse glowed softly behind them, a beacon of work, love, and second chances. Sometimes, God hides his miracles in the smallest places, not in thunder or fire, but in quiet hearts and weathered hands. Daniel's broken boathouse was never just wood and nails. It was a prayer answered slowly, plank by plank, through kindness, faith, and the courage to keep building even when life falls apart. For every storm that tests us, there is calm waiting beneath. A reminder that God's love doesn't always arrive with lightning. Sometimes it comes as a loyal dog, a warm hand, or a new beginning when we least deserve it. If this story touched your heart, share it. Let someone else feel that hope too. Leave a comment below about the small miracles you've seen in your own life. And don't forget to subscribe so more stories of faith, love, and redemption can find their way to those who need them most. May God bless you, and may every storm you face lead you closer to His quiet miracles.